Hey, what are you doing sleeping here? You're not seriously going to make me bring this, are you? Looking over, I found my stepson Zach pointing at the lunch on the table. Zach, who's always particular about his food, checks the contents of the sandwich inside the lunchbox and which snack is packed with the sandwich. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got a fever of 104 degrees. I've been tormented by a high fever since this morning but I stood up, reaching to put the sandwich in the lunchbox. However, Zach roughly brushed the sandwich aside with his hand. Hey, why would you do that? Though I was suffering from the fever, I raised my voice. Then, Zach's face suddenly flushed with anger and started to tremble. He grabbed the vase from the table and threw it at me with all his might. Your dad's parasite, don't you dare slack off at home. As Zach, my husband Ashton's son from his previous marriage, grew up, his attitude towards me worsened. But this was the first time he went this far. I staggered but managed to dodge the vase thrown by Zach. He must have been really upset to be scolded by me. I can't forgive him, but I'm too sick to deal with Zach right now. I feel like I could collapse at any moment because I'm feeling so unwell. Enough is enough. Suddenly, I hear a shout from behind me. It's unmistakably Ashton's voice, and I thought the scolding was directed at me. I had told Ashton about feeling unwell last night. It's too much, just because lunch was only a simple sandwich. When I timidly turn around, there stood Ashton. Looking furious like never before, his shoulders shaking with anger. At Ashton's feet lay the shattered pieces of the vase thrown by Zach, wetting the floor. Zach looks at me with a serves-you-right expression upon Ashton's entrance. Just as Zach starts to smirk and opens his mouth, an unexpected word comes out of Ashton's mouth. My name is Tracy. I'm a 49-year-old housewife. I married my current husband Ashton when I was 42. It was my first marriage, but for Ashton, this was his second. I met Ashton at my previous job. I was doing clerical work at the company, and Ashton, who frequently visited as a salesman, became an acquaintance. I've always been shy around people, but as I talked with Ashton, who was serious and honest, I was drawn to his character. Ashton had a son from his previous marriage. I was surprised when I learned that such a serious person had been married before. Could it be that even for someone like him, a marriage could fail? That's what I initially thought, but after hearing the details from Ashton, I felt sympathy. Ashton's ex-wife was quite the partier, and the divorce was caused by her infidelity. Even though he knew about her bad habits during their relationship, Ashton believed they would change. However, no matter how hard Ashton tried, the outcome didn't change. Despite saying I won't do it again, his ex-wife cheated repeatedly. Even after their son was born, her bad habits didn't stop, and Ashton finally decided to divorce. He couldn't leave his son with such a mother, a tough decision indeed. Ashton dearly loved the son he had with his ex-wife, who he used to be deeply in love with. The son's name is Zach, and he's now 21 years old, attending college. Though there's no blood relation between me and him, he became my son when I married Ashton. I had been introduced to Zach several times during our dating period. The first time I met Zach, he was 10 years old. Since it was a very sensitive issue, Ashton and I took our time to talk to Zach about it. No matter how much we loved each other, if Zach rejected us, that would be it. Being a primary school student, it was difficult for him to understand everything. To be honest, it didn't seem like it was such an important matter to Zach. Without any rejection, Zach became my son. However, once we started living together, Zach's troubles became apparent. Ashton is a businessman working in sales at a major insurance company. He's serious by nature and has been raising Zach alone since his divorce from his ex-wife. While raising a child, he also managed to do his job well at the company, eventually becoming an executive. Ashton worked hard for Zach's sake, ensuring that Zach could live a life without experiencing any misfortune. But raising a child alone has its limits, even for a father. After work, it often got late, or I ended up leaving Zach alone. Though my parents-in-law live not too far away, Ashton, being the serious type, didn't like relying too much on them. That inevitably led to him being overly indulgent with Zach. He compensated for not being able to spend much time with him by buying him various things and spoiling him. Seeing this, Zach grew cunning. He knew that by acting good in front of Dad, he could get anything he wanted. He became increasingly adept at committing misdeeds without the adults around him noticing. That was precisely how he was acting when I first met Ashton. For Zach, my presence was nothing but an annoyance. He probably thought that having a new mother figure would take away his freedom. Yet, he didn't oppose our marriage because he saw me as an outlet for his stress. Even as a child, he exploited my delicate position. Before we were married, I was a guest, and Ashton prioritized me. But once married, we were family. Zach understood this too well, knowing that Ashton would put his blood-related son first. Whose words would Ashton believe first, mine or Zach's? Once the three of us started living together, Zach's attitude towards me changed drastically, and the harassment began. I was prepared for some rebellion from a boy in elementary school, but since Dad's feeding you, it's only natural you take care of me, right? What I say goes, so get used to it. The first time Zach said such abusive words to me, I was furious. Those aren't words a child should say to a parent, and it shouldn't be allowed. Zach, do you understand what you just said? Even if it was a joke, there are things you shouldn't say. Think about why Mom is angry. Zach listened to my words with a smirking face. Rather, he seemed to enjoy being scolded. It was eerie to see Zach smirking through my serious scolding. He understood his position as a stepson and how we might be seen by society. Having had little to do with children before, I was appalled by how cunning he was. I never imagined a child could say such things. That night, when Ashton came home, I told him about the incident with Zach. The unnaturally mature behavior, the abusive words towards me. I was nearly in a panic, but made sure to convey everything to Ashton. However, contrary to my feelings, Ashton's thoughts were exactly as Zach predicted. Zach said that to you? No way. Aren't you exaggerating a bit? Zach isn't the kind of child to say such things. Ashton didn't take my report seriously and refused to believe Zach's abusive words. No matter how much I insisted, Ashton's reaction didn't change. On the contrary, he was irritated by my persistence. Tracy just doesn't like Zach because he's not her real son, he implied without saying it outright, but it was apparent in his actions. Let's drop this subject. You used to care so much about Zach before we got married. I'm disappointed in you. Ashton said that inside deeply. I didn't want to hear such words from Ashton. Despite everything, I was seriously engaging with Zach. I no longer thought of him as someone else's child. But from Ashton's perspective, it seemed I was seen that way. Ashton's words crushed me. Saying any more would only worsen our relationship. I felt that and gave up on discussing about Zach any further. Zach, who had been watching secretly, grew confident from the situation. Dad really does believe in me, he concluded with deep conviction. Still, there were times when my patience ran out. If this continued, Zach would grow up to be a terrible adult. I was afraid of ruining my relationship with Ashton, but each time I scolded Zach and consulted Ashton. However, the result was always the same. I even directly asked Zach several times, but he dismissed it. I would never say such a thing to Mom, right? It must be a misunderstanding or you misheard. Maybe Mom just feels that I'm in the way. Zach exploited my position, using it to wedge himself into Ashton's affections. If things continue this way, Zach will keep having his way, and eventually, irreversible cracks will form in my relationship with Ashton. The parental instinct to do what's best for Zach started to be suppressed deep down. I tried to refrain from interfering in Zach's actions as much as possible, and even kept my emotions in check. I didn't want to resort to such thinking, but Zach would eventually leave this home, and I just had to endure until then. Perhaps, in time, his feelings towards me would change, and he might even apologize. In my daily interactions with Zach, I knew the likelihood of that happening was almost nil. However, I had no choice but to keep encouraging myself. And so, I continued to deceive myself, desperately enduring each day. It was around the time Zach was about to graduate from high school. Having been tutored by a top-notch instructor, Zach had secured admission to one of the most competitive universities in the state. Perhaps feeling relieved after securing his admission, he started to act even more arrogantly than before. That day, Ashton was away on a business trip that lasted several days, leaving the house empty. In the evening, after finishing the chores, I waited for Zach's return. With Ashton not around, we were supposed to have dinner together, so I prepared a proper menu as usual. However, Zach didn't return even after his usual time had passed. I hadn't heard anything, but maybe he was delayed by a class or something. Could something have happened? I sent a message to Zach's mobile phone, but there was no reply from him. Even past 8 p.m., with no contact from Zach, I didn't start dinner, waiting for him to return. About an hour later, I heard a noisy group outside the house. Feeling a bad premonition, I opened the front door, and there stood Zach, bringing along several boys and girls. What? You're home? We're gonna have a party now, so can you leave? Upon seeing my face, Zach clicked his tongue and said that. From behind, jeers like "When is it gonna start?" and "Hurry up" followed. Leave! I was making dinner, waiting for you to come home. I threw back at Zach, bewildered. It was unthinkable to allow a party with many university students at this hour. Like I care! This is my house, so just get out of the way! Zach yelled, pushing past me to enter the house. Following him, the group of boys and girls also started pouring into the house. Powerless, I could only watch the procession. Soon after, loud music began to play inside, and the students' clamor reached my ears. This would surely disturb the neighbors. I rushed through the students towards Zach, covering my ears. Turn off the music now! I shouted, trying not to be drowned out by the music. However, Zach deliberately ignored me, pretending not to hear. Overwhelmed by the students' fervor, I was helpless. I'm not sure how long it had been, but the sound of sirens began to mix with the loud music. Predictably, the sirens belonged to police officers, called by a neighbor's report. As the guardian, I received a stern warning, and Zach and his friends were ordered to disperse. I was just embarrassed and sorry for causing such a nuisance over something so trivial. While Zach had been meek in front of the officers, he started complaining to me once everyone had left. Who called the cops? Seriously, so annoying. The next day, when Ashton returned from his trip, I reported the incident and asked him to talk to Zach. "You're not a child anymore. Act with the awareness of an adult and live without shame." Zach apologized to me sincerely after being lectured by Ashton. Later, Zach and Ashton went to apologize to the neighbors together. After receiving a good scolding from the neighbors, Zach returned home with tears in his eyes, seemingly having learned his lesson. I thought Zach had truly reflected and changed, but my hopes were soon dashed. One night, sometime after Zach started university, I was suddenly hit by a chill and measured my temperature with the thermometer. I had a slight fever. Although I had no symptoms of a cold, my body felt sluggish and my head wasn't clear. I told Ashton I would go to bed early, just to be safe, and went to sleep. The next morning, the alarm clock went off at 5 a.m. as usual so I could prepare Zach's lunch. Upon waking, I was hit by a severe headache, barely able to lift myself up. Somehow managing to get out of bed, I checked my temperature. 104 degrees, this was definitely bad. However, I felt I still had to prepare Zach's lunch. Clinging to tables and walls, I barely made it to the kitchen. In this condition, it was impossible to cook properly. Normally, I make everything from scratch, including sandwiches along with homemade scones and muffins. I usually pack some fruits as well. But today, I decided to just make a simple sandwich with some vegetables to keep the nutritional balance in mind. Despite the high fever, I desperately finished making Zach's lunch. Maybe it was the relief of finishing the lunch, but I fell asleep for a moment in the dining chair, only to be awakened by Zach's voice. "Hey, what are you doing sleeping here? You're not seriously going to make me bring this, are you?" Looking up, Zach was pointing at the sandwich on the table. Zach, who's always particular about his food, checks the contents of the sandwich inside the lunchbox and which snack is packed with the sandwich. "Oh, I'm sorry. I've got a fever of 104 degrees. I stood up, reaching to put the sandwich into the lunchbox. However, Zach roughly brushed off the sandwich on the table aside with his hand. "Hey, why would you do that?" Even with the fever, I raised my voice. Then, Zach's face suddenly turned red, and his body began to shake with anger. He grabbed a vase from the table and threw it at me with all his might. "Don't slack off on housework. You're nothing but Dad's parasite." I staggered but managed to dodge the vase thrown by Zach. He must have been really upset to be scolded by me. I can't forgive him, but I'm too ill to deal with Zach right now. I feel like I could collapse at any moment because I'm feeling so unwell. "Enough is enough!" Suddenly, I hear a shout from behind me. It was undoubtedly Ashton's voice, and I thought the scolding was directed at me. I had told Ashton I was feeling unwell last night. This is too much, just because I made a simple lunch. When I timidly turned around, there stood Ashton. Looking furious like never before, his shoulders shaking with anger. At Ashton's feet lay the shattered pieces of the vase thrown by Zach, wetting the floor. Zach looked at me with a serves-you-right expression upon Ashton's entrance. Just as Zach starts to smirk and opens his mouth, Ashton shouted again. "Zach, I'm talking about you!" Zach stopped in his tracks at Ashton's angry voice, unable to comprehend Ashton's reprimand. "Huh? What are you talking about? Dad?" Zach was visibly shaken, his body trembling. Looking as if he might cry, staggering towards me. "You have a fever. Tracy, you should be resting." Ashton, still glaring at Zach, approached me and told me so. Unable to grasp the situation, I too stood frozen, unable to move. Then, Ashton gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "Just leave this to me." I cautiously looked up at Ashton's face and slowly nodded. There was no sign of resentment or anger in his gaze. If anything, his eyes conveyed regret and apology. Supported by Ashton, I managed to sit down on a nearby chair. While I sat down with Ashton's help, Zach, unable to hide his disturbance, was mouthing words as if wanting to say something. "Thank you." After seating me, Ashton began to ignore Zach and started cleaning up the broken vase pieces scattered on the floor. After gathering the shards, he carefully wiped the wet floor and picked up the flowers that were miserably scattered around. The flowers I had bought had their petals scattered from being thrown. Ashton carefully placed a few flowers into a cup filled with water. During this time, Zach was so overwhelmed by the somber atmosphere that he couldn't say anything. He seemed to understand what was coming next. As Ashton turned back to face Zach, his eyes were again filled with fierce anger. "You're no longer a child of this house. Do you understand what you've done to Mom?" Ashton muttered sternly while glaring at Zach. The kitchen fell silent, with Ashton's heavy words echoing. "Wait, Dad, what are you talking about? Stop with the bad jokes. They're not funny." Sensing Ashton's intention, Zach, though panicking, tried to respond jokingly. "Pack your things and leave immediately." Ignoring Zach's remarks, Ashton said this quietly before placing his hand on my shoulder in shock. "Come on, lie down in bed." I nodded silently and then went to the bedroom with Ashton's support. As I lay down, Ashton covered me with a blanket. "I'm sorry for everything up to now. I sensed he was looking down on you, but I never imagined he was acting like that behind my back. Tracy, you kept quiet for his sake, didn't you?" Ashton's voice trembled as he repeated "I'm sorry" several times. "After you rest a bit, we'll go to the hospital." Ashton was visibly shaken and disturbed, but after a while, he said this and left the room. The kind words from Ashton, whom I thought would blame me, filled my heart. It wasn't just Zach he loved, he had been loving me properly as well. Ashton was struggling in his own way, watching over me. Despite the severe fever making my body ache, the pain was forgotten as a glimmer of hope started to shine in my heart. After Ashton took me to the hospital, the diagnosis was a high fever due to overwork. I was told to rest easy for a while, and then I started recuperating at home. When we returned home, Zach was still walking around with a big bag, seemingly in disbelief. He continued packing while watching Ashton, but Ashton didn't even look at Zach. After a while, Zach seemed to give up and left the house. He had become a university student. He could take care of himself, but I never imagined it would come to this. Zach will probably seek refuge with his grandparents or friends and return home once things settled down. Ashton's anger was way past normal. However, he wouldn't abandon his beloved son. I had naively thought so, but Ashton's resolution was far firmer than I imagined. As expected, Zach fled to his grandparents' house. He lied to his grandparents, saying Mom kicked me out, and managed to win their sympathy. Oh my! How terrible! I'll talk to Dad myself, so tell me everything that happened. Zach, thrilled at deceiving his grandparents, planned to use this opportunity to frame me. He started claiming that he had been receiving terrible harassment from me, who was not his real mother, all along. He fabricated a story about throwing the vase in a panic to protect himself during this incident. Dad is misunderstanding, he pleaded with tears, winning his grandparents over to his side. Poor thing! You can skip university today and just rest. Don't worry about Mom, I'll handle her properly. Zach, satisfied that his plan was working, proudly snuggled into the prepared bed. I'll play the role of a grandson who can't recover from the shock. Zach believed this without a doubt. However, Zach was about to face a far worse hell. The next day, Zach wore a smug face as he left for the university, while his grandparents sent him off. He thought this might be his chance to get rid of me, the nuisance. He had been using everyone to his advantage so far, thinking it was about time. Everything seemed to be going according to his plans, but as the lecture started, his belief crumbled with a noise. Zach, I received a notice of withdrawal from the university by your dad yesterday. The instructor, recognizing Zach, said this with a troubled look. The room started buzzing at those words.
What? What do you mean? That can't be right. Must be some mistake.
With Zach's desperate plea, the instructor said he would check and left the classroom. Zach tried to respond confidently to the gazes from around him. Don't worry, it's gonna be fine. The teacher must have confused me with someone else. Making a fuss over nothing. Yet, a bad premonition ran through Zach's mind. No way, he wouldn't go that far. When the instructor returned, he told Zach straightforward. There's no mistake. Zach, your withdrawal has been processed. With the instructor's words, the room buzzed even more, and Zach was engulfed in despair. Filled with embarrassment, Zach's face turned red, and he dashed out of the classroom.
This can't be happening. What's going on?
Racing down the long corridor, Zach muttered complaints under his breath. Why dominated his thoughts, slipping out unintentionally. He pulled out his mobile phone to call Ashton. However, Ashton had blocked his calls, leaving Zach unable to connect. Panicked, Zach hurried towards his grandparents' house. Upon arrival, he was greeted by the sight of his bag thrown in front of the entrance.
What is this?
Zach's panic intensified as he rang the doorbell. Seeing no response, he desperately banged on the front door.
Grandma! Grandpa!
He pleaded with tears in his voice, but there was no answer from inside. In that moment, Zach realized. He had been betrayed by his grandparents. With nowhere else to go, Zach grabbed his discarded bag and headed home. Hoping for some mistake, but the reality of the situation was clear. Sobbing, Zach rang the doorbell upon his return, and I was there to greet him.
What's happening? I was wrong. Please help me.
I led in Zach, who was sobbing. And he continued to cry even louder, perhaps feeling relieved. As planned, I took Zach to the room where Ashton was waiting. Zach remained inconsolable in front of Ashton, who watched silently, waiting for the crying to stop. Eventually realizing this, Zach ceased his tears. Once Zach had stopped, Ashton, still stern, finally spoke.
What do you intend to do by coming here now?
With those words, Zach was filled with despair again. He wasn't forgiven. There was no return to this home. You should know, Grandma and Grandpa won't let you in anymore either, I said, adding insult to injury. The plan had always been to welcome Zach if he fled to them, then to turn him away. This shock was greater than an outright rejection. It was retaliation for Zach, who had pretended to repent but betrayed my trust. He was to experience firsthand what I had endured.
There's no plan to revoke your university expulsion. If you want to continue, figure out the tuition yourself.
The expulsion was Ashton's decision, not something I had considered. It was to ensure Zach faced the consequences of his actions.
Before marrying Tracy, I might have made you feel neglected. That's why I prioritized you over her. You were always good in front of me,
and I believed you were repentant for your mistakes. Despite knowing better, Ashton had indulged Zach excessively, feeling sorry for him losing his mother and trying to compensate. But Zach's continuous disrespect and the vase-throwing incident were the last straw for Ashton. In a way, Ashton blamed his own upbringing for Zach's repulsive character. Unable to forgive the years of suffering Zach had caused me, Ashton had no choice but to believe in the harsh reality. Taking everything from Zach and casting him aside was also a punishment for Ashton himself.
So, I can't get help from you anymore? I can't make it on my own.
Zach pleaded tearfully, but Ashton's mind was made up. As a small mercy, Ashton handed Zach a month's worth of living expenses. In this limited time, Zach had no choice but to fend for himself. For Zach, who had been coddled and used to getting his way, this was hell. Being expelled from university meant he was off the promised elite path. Cut off from his parents and grandparents, he had to navigate life alone. The grandparents had always doted on Zach, their grandson. But after Ashton revealed Zach's numerous transgressions against me, their perspective shifted. No matter how beloved, some actions are unforgivable. At first, the word disownment seemed to baffle them a bit. But with Ashton's firm resolve and considering Zach's own situation, they cooperated. That very day, Zach rented a room in an old, dingy apartment where he could afford with the little money he had. The bath and toilet were shared, and the room was covered with thin, grimy walls. If he ever made noise with a large group of friends like before, he would be kicked out immediately. Staring at the little money he had left, Zach shed tears. He had lost his home and his family. His friends, who had always enjoyed Zach's generosity, were gone, having only used him. Zach, always unreasonable and lacking common sense, had kept his friends around with money. Now without any support, his future was bleak. He had never worked part-time before, relying on his parents for all his social expenses. Could someone as spoiled as him even manage to work? To survive, he had to find even the most grueling jobs. Thinking about this, Zach couldn't stop the tears from flowing. A year had passed since Zach left our home. Ashton started to put me first again, like when we first met. For about 10 years, everything had revolved around Zach, so we were reclaiming our relationship. I no longer had to ponder over Zach, allowing me to purely enjoy my relationship with Ashton. I'm truly sorry for all the hardship I've caused. I became blinded by my love for my son. I had never voiced it, but whenever Ashton criticized my statements about Zach, I would become physically ill from the stress. Being attacked on the point of having no blood relation felt like exploiting a vulnerability. Legally, he was my son, but that was one aspect I couldn't change. I felt devastated, as if being targeted for an unavoidable weakness. Now, Ashton and I can talk about it because Ashton himself always had this sensitive issue in the back of his mind. Not in a bad way, but he had decided never to mention it to me. Knowing how much it troubled me, Ashton began apologizing whenever possible. Zach's departure seemed to have freed us from various entanglements. Whether he knew it or not, Zach started sending letters periodically. They weren't about wanting to mend our relationship, but rather updating us on his situation. Perhaps it was his way of apologizing. Since that day, he has been desperately looking for work, sustaining his days through manual labor. Although Ashton says nothing, he seems somewhat relieved by these letters. We won't reach out anymore, but it's eased our minds. It's difficult for us to have children at our age, but it seems we can live harmoniously as a couple. There were more hardships than happiness, making everyday survival a challenge. But now, I can walk through my life, a bright and joyful one.